Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. So, Shop Talk, as always, we're here to make Monday evening a little more pleasant. Spend an hour just jibber-jabbering about various topics in the data platform space. If you have questions, sometimes we have answers. Mike actually has a question, and I have an answer. So, that worked out pretty well. It's not always a one-to-one ratio. Sometimes we have 4 answers to 1 question. Sometimes it's, 1 question and 0 answers. But we'll find out. Speaking of Mike, let's introduce the panel. Not starting with Mike. Over this way, we've got Mala. How you doing, Mala?
Good evening, everyone. Doing well.
Excellent. And in roughly that direction, Tracy.
I'm over here on my screen. Hi.
Oh, well, everybody's going to see you as the square below me. So we're just going to have to...
Not me?
Right, but the rest of the world will. That's just how it works. This is Hollywood Squares. Just because you think you're in a different square doesn't mean you're there.
Can't confine me to a square.
And finally, Mike gets the O.
Hello, everybody.
All right.
My square, Mike.
And, hey, we have our 5th board member in the audience, Rick Pack. How you doing, Rick?
Was that because of the R-related question that he decided to hop on?
We may actually bring that up. So I'm going to try to reorganize this text box because it's going to cover Mike's face pretty well throughout the course of the evening. So, we'll see. We'll see how we shake this out. Mike, you're just going to have to move your head around like this. Okay. As we get going, let's start by introducing our first topic of the evening, which is a couple of conferences. First one, Past Summit. There is a discount code for user groups. That is Azure 175. Saves $175 off of registration. So that is for, if I remember right, that is for the in-person ticket for Past Data Community Summit. Coming up in Seattle in November-ish.
Yep,
And November-ish. It's one of those weeks sometime a few months from now.
The second full week. Second full week.
Second full week of November? Okay. Whoa. I grabbed the wrong one. This is a very professional broadcast. You can tell just how professional we are here. There we go. Look at that. Look at that. I've moved everything around. Like true professionals. Nobody even noticed. So yeah, second week of November, you said, Tracy?
Mm-hmm.
Good. That's just enough time for me to panic.
Double digits, yeah.
Talk that I'm putting together, so.
Me too.
So if you are interested in that, Mala just posted a link in chat. Check that out. Speaking of Mala, you also wanted to announce Group Buy.
Yeah, Group Buy, the online conference that's been around for some time. It's currently run by a mutual friend of ours in this group, Eugene Meidinger. He has taken over from the older team. So that conference is tomorrow and day after. And the link is here. It is entirely online and there are some cool speakers, including me.
That's groupbuy.org. And I will now hold it personally against Eugene because I've never gotten the opportunity to speak at Group Buy. So now, Eugene, there's a vendetta.
I can't wait to hear this on the podcast you two do with Carlos.
Yeah, where we do this on the SQL Data Partners podcast. It's going to be the most polite vendetta ever.
It probably will be. It'll just be like a little jab here and there, but we'll go the inside joke on it.
Yeah, I mean, considering
I'm sure you're going to get it in there.
Right. Well, considering the way that that podcast normally goes, nobody would ever notice the difference.
I think
you have some fans, Kevin, who are regular listeners. We do notice. There's just not many of us.
No. The difference between a normal podcast and a podcast where Eugene and I now have a vendetta, because we're normally razzing each other pretty well. So
we might pick up on us normal listeners that listen to it every week, or every month or every 2 weeks, however often you do it.
Yeah, there you go. So everybody, go listen to that podcast, and also stay on Shop Talk and that way you'll get the full story.
Yep.
This feels like a
And more
cross-promotional
learning to do
opportunity.
over there. If you haven't been listening, now you got to go back and pick up the catalog, how far back ever it goes with Eugene and Kevin, so you'll know.
Right, the true history. All right. So our first real topic of the night. When the beef started. Exactly. It's so if somebody's putting together the Shop Talk wiki for the deep lore of the Triangle Area SQL Server users group, this is a good place to start it. Our first topic of the night, we have a problem that was brought in by Mike. So Mike came to actually posted this like 2 hours ago and said, "Hey, I have something I'm working on. Can you fix my problems for me?" He was phrased slightly differently, but effectively, yeah.
I did solve it. I just needed to solve it better than I solved it.
That is true. Mike did have a solution. We're not going to see Mike's solution. Just assume that it's a perfectly good solution. Shoptalk.fandom.com. There we go. We could set that thing up. Or somebody could stand up a wiki. That would work. I would almost do it just for the fun. But we do have shoptalk.tripass.org where I actually do have little synopses of each episode. So that way you can go back and watch all the horrors. This is a different type of podcast. So let's talk about Mike's data problem instead of my speech problem. Let me swing on over here and share my screen. This will be the first time I've shared screen in a while on Shop Talk, and I'm trying something new. I'm sharing just a window. Look at that. It all worked. So what we have here is that Mike's got a little data set. And that data set, let's bump it up one more notch. That data set right here basically is a list of ICD-10 codes. And the trickiness is that we have the code itself and then this flag of, is it a group? Now, this is roughly in order. Fortunately, we don't actually have an ordering, except that this is all alphabetical. And so if group name is 1, it is actually kind of a child of the next highest 0. So in other words, all of these are children of this A00. A01 has no children, but A010 has several children. It got around in its youth. And then we have A02. And so Mike was saying, hey, what I want to be able to do is a couple of things. One, we can easily filter to get just the parents. But what I'd love to do is, if it's A014, I want to know that it rolls up to A010. So how do I roll up to that value? And Mike came up with a solution. And in fairness, the solution works. But we do want to try to come up with a better solution. I think this will be better. So first thing I want to do, I actually want IDs. I want to make sure that I actually do have a proper value for these, and because I don't have one already, I'm going to load into a temp table the row number ordered by ICD-10 value, knowing that all of those are in alphabetical order, and on the basis of being in alphabetical order, everything will work out fine. So if we select star from ICD-10, we can see that things are not in order, but I can order it by ID. And now we have pretty much the same data set as before, except that I have ID number. Row number, by the way, if you've not seen this before, generates a unique ascending value. It is monotonically increasing with respect to our order by clause. So with respect to ICD-10, that alphanumeric code, it will always increase as a result of getting a new row. If I monotonically, saying 10 times fast. You know, I could probably do better with monotonically than with horrors. It's the double R. I think that's the thing that gets it. But because I'm trying to extricate myself from, you know, having Shop Talk get canceled, we're gonna keep talking about this and monotonically increasing functions. So we have our IDs, and what we want to do is basically say, all right, well, ID 1 is a proper value, and everything after 1 up until the next 0 here is going to be associated with ID 1. And then this will be associated with ID 5, this will be associated with 6, all of these will be with 6, and so on. There are a couple of ways to do this. And I'm going to show you the way that works in SQL Server and the way that should work in SQL Server. So let's start with the way that works in SQL Server. First, what I want to do is say, hey, let's select values and determine if group flag is 0, then I want the ID. Otherwise, I want null. Why am I doing this? So that I can basically do something called last observation carried forward. Now, in order for this to actually show up appropriately, I do need to order within my common table expression.
Mm-hmm.
And what I have is, okay, group ID 1, null, null, null. So I want to fill those with a 1. So I want to take the last valid observation, carry it forward until my next valid observation. In SQL Server, today, we can do this in a couple of different ways. And this comes from an article by Itzik Ben-Gan, of course, from about 7 years back. I'm going to show you one of the two methods that he came up with. I'll link to the article. That is a really good book from Itzik, yes. I'll link to the article because it shows a second method, which is a lot more complex, but also a lot faster. So if you need to do this at extreme scale, this first approach is mediocre. But for our purposes, no problem at all. So what are we doing? We're going to say, give me, for each record, I am essentially going to say, case when group ID is not null, then group ID end as group ID. And that is the set of valid group IDs. And I'm going to get the maximum group ID ordered by ID, rows unbounded preceding. So in other words, when I'm, say, down here in 6, I'm going to get the maximum group ID, which will be the set of 1, 5, and 6, because it is to the current row, and it is everything preceding.
Right.
So that way, when I come down here to say this null, it's going to be 1, 2, 5, 6, 18, and we're going to get the maximum group ID, which is 18, and apply it here. So if I run this query, what I end up with, if you please, is 1s carried forward until we get to the 5, then 6s carried forward until we get to 18, and so on. So this is a working solution. No real qualms about it. That said, it is a solution that, with 100,000 rows, no big deal. If I had 100 million rows, probably a fairly big deal. Let's see if the query, the execution plan viewer in Azure Data Studio has improved at all. We have a table scan. We have a sort. What's that, Mike?
I was just going to ask that, if that was an add-on or...
No, this is it's just a fairly new version of Azure Data Studio, so they've added in a newer form of explain plans that is not as awful as the original form. It's still in preview. It's still not nearly as good as SQL Server Management Studio, much less Century 1 Data Explorer, which I guess is no longer Century 1 Data Explorer, or whatever, Plan Explorer. but pour one out for them. So we have a table scan. We then in parallel have our window function. So we have a segment, we have a sequence, we have a segment, we have a window spool. So I'm doing a couple of window operators in here, a couple of segmentation operations, and my window spool is collecting the values in here, my cross-apply operation. We're aggregating, stream aggregating to get the max value over this stream. And the end result is, on the whole, a reasonable query. I would not probably have a problem with this up into the, I don't know, tens of millions of rows. So, okay. Can I do it better? The answer is technically yes. This is last observation carried forward the way it should be. So instead of having max and a cross apply, we could use last value and get the last group ID, ignoring nulls, ordered by ID ascending. But you'll notice there's a whole bunch of squigglies, and that is because if I run this in SQL Server, I get an error. That error is technically wrong because I do have an over clause, but it's choking with ignore nulls. However, if you ran this in Azure SQL Edge, this query would work. So Azure SQL Edge allows you to do last observation carried forward. Oracle allows you to do last observation carried forward. So actually I gave this version to Mike. He was doing this in Oracle. And this version doesn't work in Oracle because cross apply is not valid there. You could probably do a lateral view, but would involve a little rewriting. This version works perfectly over there and also works perfectly on a Raspberry Pi, but does not work perfectly in Azure SQL Database, SQL Managed Instance, SQL Server on premises, or Synapse Analytics, pretty much anything except for Azure SQL Edge. I am hopeful that this will work at some point in the future because I think it's a very clear explanation. It's a very clear query in terms of being able to say, give me the last value and ignore any nulls because null isn't a value. And that's the takeaway I want everybody to come home with. Null is not a value. And with that, let's stop sharing. And then we'll drop in some links. While I'm dropping in some links, link sale. That's right. 2 for the price of 1. Technically, it's 2 for the price of 2.
Yes, that's awesome. Thank you for looking at that. So I think that Kevin's being nice. I think I had like 55 lines of code and he had like less than 20. So a little bit more syntactically succinct.
A little bit. But, that's all right. There's many different ways to solve a problem. And being able to see, hey, I have this problem here. What is an efficient way to solve it? It's a way to learn. You think about things like gaps and islands problems, and this is a bit of a variant on the gap and island issue.
That was what I was looking up. Yeah.
But you can get to it. So last observation carried forward. Actually, much easier to do in R or Python. But when you're sticking to just SQL, there's a couple ways to do it. So the next topic, something Mala brought up, and I want to preface this by saying that this is not a leading topic. Also, I want to make note that Tracy's cat has invaded and has stolen the camera. Probably ran off with it. So our next topic is
That was best given just the viewpoint I have of the cat at the moment to turn the camera on.
That's true. I mean, we're already getting banned for what I'm saying. We don't want Twitch to automatically censor our video now. So Mala, user groups going away.
So every week I keep hearing of yet another group shutting down. And we seem to be kind of the exception out here. But a lot of the groups, especially the smaller groups, are finding it hard to go on. Audience is dwindling most of the time. The people who sign up don't show up virtually. The real world has its own challenges with no sponsorship and lack of spaces to run an in-person event, even assuming people are going to show up. So it's kind of a mess out there. We don't know where we are going, and without any parent organization, and that's my opinion, by the way. There aren't any numbers or specifics to go by. This is mostly hearsay, but I do know for a certainty that it's happening. And want to take this opportunity to say thank you to those of you who show up here for every one of our shows and at our user group meetings and everything. You guys are the reason that we are able to stay afloat. Um, so thank you.
This is true. It's not just my ego keeping TriPass going. It's mostly you folks. So yeah, and like I said, that's not any sort of secret cryptic announcement that TriPass is doing something. No, we are stubborn and set in our ways, and we'll continue to keep trotting on because that is the way things go. But
Amen.
I do understand, a lot of people for the last couple of years, hey, we can't meet in person. So quite a few user groups have gone by the wayside. When everybody's online, when every group is virtual, it's hard to differentiate. There's no reason to have 500 different user groups based on geographic locale when everybody's basically in seeing the same people, the same set of speakers giving the same set of talks in the same venues in the same places. There's no geographical benefit necessarily. And a lot of people who spent the time running these groups are like, well, why should I do something right now? And once you have 2 years of not having to do this thing, remembering all the pain that's involved in actually running a user group, I can understand people saying, nah, I'm good. So we'll see what happens over the next several months as we do start to see some user groups meet in person again. Our .NET user group has started doing so. They were dormant for the most part for about 2 years, almost nothing online, and just a small group of people in the Trinug Slack. By contrast, we've been virtual and running the whole time. They're back in person. They're starting to get some people. It's a small group, some stalwarts, but hopefully that as they are able to begin to get back to a regular cadence, we'll see some numbers pick up for those in-person meetings. As far as TriPass goes, we have this conversation every few months, it seems, where at some point we'll do our combination of in-person and virtual, like we were doing back in 2019. So we'll do streaming events at some point. I don't know when that will be though, but we'll keep you folks posted.
It's a bit of a challenging world out there. I don't know if anybody's it's even worth going. There are definitely advantages to meeting in person, but I don't miss going after sponsors or locations or anything like that. To be honest, it's a huge pain. The logistics with in-person events are not fun. It's a lot of hassle.
Well, I think I was having a big conversation with some colleagues about this because some of my good friends, they're going back to kind of mandatory 2 days, and we were kind of talking about how silly it was because people have now pick up and drop off from school or daycare. It's actually harder to do it 2 days a week than it would be to just be in person every day because people have year-round schools versus regular schools and different. They've adjusted their lives now.
Right.
And so by
Right.
making you go back to the office, it makes it even more challenging. And so we have 60 people in our group within IT, and we're allowed to voluntarily come in like I do, and I'm only one of 3. So if just and we're lucky we can do our jobs remotely, great, because we're programming. But
So that leads us into this whole thing about virtual conferences too. Like the first truly blended conference that I attended was the BITS conference, and I was online. And the online part didn't go that well. It was the team really struggled with it. The tech support needed was a lot, and they ran into all sorts of things that they did not anticipate. We didn't have a rehearsal of any sort, so most of us, we had all sorts of equipment that were not compatible with what they wanted, and you know it really didn't go very well. So my personal guess is that this whole blended thing will go away in a year or two, and depending on how the world goes, it will either go back to an entirely virtual conference or entirely in-person conference, because it's like running 2 conferences. It's really hard. Now the past team is working through the same thing. It's insanely hard, and the technology isn't all that efficient for streaming a real event like that. And I don't know where we are going to end up with that too.
Yeah, I'd say it's at least 1 2/3 times as difficult. There's a little
Right.
bit of overlap where, all right, well, you've got one slate of speakers, but yeah, you're right. The logistics necessary to run an in-person conference and the logistics necessary to run an online conference, for the most part, don't overlap very well. There
Right.
are conferences that have done it. Actually, we did talk about this in a prior Shop Talk episode, so go check out the Shop Talk site, shoptalk.tripass.org. You'll probably find the episode where we did talk about it and spent a lot of time in speaking about, what kind of logistical requirements there are for running a hybrid conference. It's definitely not trivial. So I agree with you, Mala. I think in a year or two, hybrid conferences will once again be the exception instead of
Right.
the rule.
Yeah.
And we'll see how things go. I did get the chance to attend SQL Day remotely. SQL Day is a Polish conference that I've wanted to go to in person for a few years. Unfortunately, only been able to attend virtually. That did go pretty well, although I had to wake up at about 4 a.m. for it. But, them's the breaks. Was able to present, no big issues there. They tried out some new software. It worked reasonably well. And as long as you have enough people with technical backgrounds who are readily available to assist, and you know that you have enough bandwidth at the venue, then things can work.
Mhm.
I actually don't know if there were any
I think
problems.
smaller events work well, Kevin. I think the problem that Bits had, and maybe Pass might have to, I don't know, too early to say, is just that it gets to be really big. And then the focus of the volunteers and all the other people tends to be mostly towards those who are there in person. So the online thing kind of falls through. And that's what happened with them. And I don't know. I think smaller events, it's possible.
Yeah, if you have a one track event,
Right.
that's pretty easy.
Right.
When you have 2-3 tracks,
Right.
Okay, now you need 3 cameras, 3 sets of equipment, 3 laptops, 3 microphones, 3 audio engineers, AV engineers, and or at least one AV engineer who's able to go between the rooms and make sure everything's working smoothly. But yeah, the question of in-person versus remote, who has the feeling of being loved more, I think depends on where the speaker is. So when the speaker's in person, completely agree. Your in-person people are going to get a lot more attention because I can make eye contact with you. I can see how you're doing. Oh, you have your hand up. Let me just call on you right now. Versus, let me go look over here and see if the person at the laptop has any questions from the audience.
Right.
because looking over here, that's a crapshoot. I may have questions, I may not have questions, and now by saying, "Hey, do I have questions?" No, you have no questions. Oh, okay. Versus, let me look down in the audience. Oh, good, nobody's asking questions. Let me continue on.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, in person's going to get preference. When there's remote, I think remote actually gets preference if the speaker is able to see the same details in remote as like the Q&A. So what I mean by that is, if remote questions come in and I as a speaker can see them, I can prioritize those. I don't know if anybody's got their hand raised in the classroom unless there's a camera pointing back at the classroom. And that's rare that I've seen that. The place where I have seen it is actually pre-cons for Dev Intersection back in December. There were one of the pre-cons I went to, the speaker was not able to make it to the US. And so did the presentation completely remote. So they set up a camera that was pointed at the audience so that he could see somebody's got their hand up or get a little bit of that feeling for, how's everyone doing. And actually it was a good enough microphone that he was able to hear people in the audience as well. So that that turned out to be a good experience, but that's a rare experience. So last thing our last main topic for the evening, depending on, what people in chat come up with. It's been a little quiet of an evening in chat, but that's okay. We got you covered, chat. You don't have to be on every night. Andy Leonard had a really good blog post, the technology marketing template, and it starts out a little sarcastic in the way that Andy does. It's very, very polite, very nice, gentle sarcasm. And basically, covers this notion of new technologies that attempt to replace technologies that already exist. So it's inspired by a post by Bill Inman regarding data warehouses and the ideas of everybody's tried to kill the data warehouse with something else and it doesn't work. Now, I don't like Bill Inman's concept of a data warehouse nearly as much as I like the Ralph Kimball model of facts and dimensions, but we can leave that aside. The gist of this is that there's a heavy bias in the technical community for new thing equals better thing. This is a new programming language, which means that it's better. I remember, Pepperidge Farms remembers advertising for BOS. Got a question. Who remembers BOS? BEOS. It was the Steve Jobs driven operating system that was part of the Next machines. And BEOS was advertised as this is the brand new operating system. It was developed in 1994, it was about 94. Whereas all of these other operating systems, they're going back into the 70s. They're old technology. They're not going to hold a candle to this brand new operating system. There's some intellectual stolen bases in there because, well, Linux was about that same time, except that they lump it in with all of Unix and said, oh, well, it was 1970s, or Windows was as of the 1970s, despite the fact that, Windows NT was a brand new code base. But those aside, that's not even the point. The point of it all is just because it's new doesn't actually mean it's better. BOS, I liked playing with BOS after it was dead, but you didn't have any real applications for it. There was zero ecosystem for it. There was zero market uptake for it. It probably never got past zero, like flat line in terms of user support. It never hit 1% of the market. I can guarantee you that. So we have this concept of, well, here's the new operating system. Well, operating systems are a thing where typically we don't want new. Typically we want old, because old means stable. Old means we know how to work with it. We want new features. We want, things to be faster. We want things to run more efficiently. And those tend to be evolutionary rather than let's start over from scratch. OS2 Warp. Yeah, well, Windows NT. There's a whole story about Windows NT and OS2 and the cross-pollination between those. The guys who did OS2 were brought over to Microsoft. They were foundational in developing Windows NT. Some of the old Microsoft people went over to IBM, did OS2 Warp, and that was why that was like part of why Windows 95 and OS2 had some limited cross compatibility, OS2 Warp specifically. That back in the day, because IBM and Microsoft had an agreement back then, and there was just enough contribution between the two that you were able to run some apps in both platforms. But that OS2 Warp's another great example. This is a new operating system. It never really took off. Novelty, in that case, OS2 Warp probably was a little bit better than Windows at the time. That maybe wasn't, it wasn't the problem that OS2 Warp was worse. It was more the problem that even with that limited cross compatibility, there still was a whole lot of software that didn't run on it. And also, if I remember right, IBM licensing kind of sucked at that point. But we have these same concepts, these same debates with programming languages. We have them with technology stacks. We have them with hardware, with software. What is that a set of keywords for, Mike?
C. There's not that many.
Yeah.
On your point about, they haven't changed the standard very many times because they thought about stuff in advance when they made C. And C came from somewhere else, but I've been reading a little bit about C and practicing it a little bit, and it's fascinating that it can do. A lot of languages can do all the same things, but to your point, like, are other programming languages better? And they might have less syntax, and they might be easier or faster to write in, but a lot of C programs still work, even if they were written in the 80s.
Yeah. We could contrast that with C++. C++ has seen enormous shifts, and many of those shifts were for the better. C++ was kind of it was a bit of a half-baked language when it came out, and for the first 15 years. But new versions, when you get to the latest, say, 10 years of C++, there have been some pretty radical changes in the language spec.
Like
Solomon says
Python 3
Sybase 2. What's that, Mike?
Like Python 3 level changes? Like breaking changes?
Actually, yeah, some breaking changes from 90s code, for sure. Sybase 2, i.e. SQL Server. 4.21 was the version that was SQL Server. So SQL Server 4.21 was Sybase SQL Server 4.21. And it was essentially bought the code, sold it as Microsoft. And then they started working on the separate SQL Server that is not Sybase anymore. But hey, Sybase is still around. You can still buy Sybase SQL Server with its Transact SQL language. It is still useful. New York financial institutions still tend to use Sybase a lot. So back to the point, Andy talks a lot about what he calls chronological snobbery. And it is our bias that this thing which is new is therefore better. And he has a fake marketing template that I think is kind of fun. That, as having this old technology in your enterprise is a business risk. It's a security risk. It's You're gonna fail because these other companies that are using new technology are way better. We can have fun inputting our own whatever we want in here. Cold Fusion, Ruby on Rails. Put in whatever you want in there, regardless of whether you like it or not. I mean, I could just as easily say, F#, Xamarin. I don't pick whatever you want for this, even if it is on net better, like F#. Cold Fusion, yeah, that was one of my first jobs. This is no longer on my resume. One of my first jobs was Cold Fusion development. I was an intern at a hospital in Dayton, Ohio, and helping with Cold Fusion development. Was that Tracy?
I developed on Cold Fusion.
Everybody was. In
I used to do websites.
1998 to 2002.
Yeah. Yeah. Up until a few years ago, I would still occasionally get Cold Fusion spam emails. Hey, we have this job. Like, you would have to pay
That's
me.
why it's never listed on my resume. I never listed it on my resume, even though it was something I actually did.
I had to because that was back in 2007, 2008 when I didn't have many jobs, so I kind of had to put that on there. It is no longer on there. No longer do I note that I ever knew Cold Fusion because, frankly, you wouldn't even want me doing any Cold Fusion development. It's the last time I touched it was about 17 years ago. So hopefully there have been a couple of changes since then in terms of making the language better, but maybe not.
I just hope everybody just lets me stick to SQL. I don't think you want me to go back to all that stuff I used to do.
So I think this is a pretty good. It's a pretty good summary, and I want to jump in a little bit more on the concept because when we talk about this is old code, I think it's a natural tendency of developers to say old code is bad code. I don't understand it, therefore it sucks. And first thing we look at in a code base, I don't immediately understand everything that goes on here, therefore it's awful and I need to rewrite it. Or there's this bug in the code and therefore I need to rewrite everything. And we just have this tendency to think that the thing which is there already is so terrible. Oh, Mike's coming back in. Do we want to let Mike in? I don't know if we want to let Mike in. Mike's already here.
What is that then?
Huh? What are you talking about? Mike's here.
Yeah. Well, there's a little pop-up that Mike wanted to come back in. So
I don't think you should let that mic in because we don't know what mic that is. Sure,
yeah, he's
Mike's
that
here.
dedicated to Shop Talk that he wants to be in here twice.
Oh, now he's gone.
That's okay. He'll be back.
I'm so confused.
So old code. You know, we have this bias against it, but for the most part, Mike was deprecated. You technically weren't deprecated. You were, what do we want to say? Voted off the island. I mean, you kind of voted yourself off the island there. I didn't kick you out.
What happened to him?
There we go. Mike's back. Mike is back, and we're good to go. So, old code does have that benefit of working. Flash Mike. This is not the type of stream for that, Mike.
No, you know, the Flash table. Never mind.
This is not an Adobe Flash stream, Mike. We don't talk about Silverlight here. My favorite software ad that I can remember was for Windows 2000. It was a blue screen and said something like, "Tired of the blue screen of death? Upgrade to 2000." Saying our previous offerings are kind of sucky, but this time we got it right. Trust us. Yeah, 2000 actually did solve a fair number of blue screen problems because Here's, the thing is, kids, let's talk about the thing here.
Back in my
Most
day.
blue screens were not the fault of Windows. Most blue screens were the fault of really terrible drivers.
Yep.
That's most of the time, if you had a blue screen, it was because you had crap drivers.
Right.
Because the people who wrote those drivers were awful.
I was waiting for the day somebody would say that. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah. Yeah, and so Windows 2000.
Windows, but
Oh, it's not just on Windows. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But Windows was notorious for it because anybody can develop on this. And so they would have drivers that barely got through any sort of testing, if they were tested at all, just released. And then they would interfere with other software that was installed on the machine. And all of a sudden you have IRQ failure, blue screen. So Windows 2000, one of the things that they did was they prevented drivers from doing certain things that would destabilize your system, because it was based on the NT code base as opposed to the Windows 95 code base. And so they had more kernel level protections that ended up actually, making it better. And so it is funny, like Solomon mentions, that the advertising campaign was, our software is not as bad as it used to be, but it was true. So when I do want to recommend tempering the expectations of novelty being necessarily superior, that this thing which is new is necessarily better than this thing which is not new, because oftentimes if it is really new, to the extent that something is novel, it's ignoring hard-earned lessons of the past. So you look at a code base and you say, this code base is awful. Look at all of these special cases. Look at all these weird things where if the customer is this, do this. If the customer is that, do this. If the customer looks like this, do this other thing. And the thing is, those were all real use cases that it may have been shoehorned in, depending on what the software looks like, but they were all real use cases that actually solved real problems that people had. And they may or may not still be relevant use cases. But if you develop something new, you're probably going to forget a bunch of those. Some of them, maybe it's not a big deal. Maybe, I lost this thing, but that was for a customer that is no longer with us. But other things, this was introduced because this customer had data corruption 10 years ago, and in our new product, oops, they have data corruption again. So many times you repeat the mistakes of the past because failure to analyze, failure to fully understand the system. And that kind of leads to the notion of Chesterton's fence. That I know that I've told this story on Shop Talk before, but I'm going to do it one more time. The idea of Chesterton's fence, you have a couple of guys who are traveling along a country road, and they see a fence. They see a little fence blocking the road. Except the thing is, it's a little fence. You could walk right around it and keep going. So one of the guys says, I'm just going to take down that fence. You can get around it. There's no problem here. I don't understand why the fence is there. And the other guy says, that's exactly why you don't take down the fence, because you don't understand why it's there. If you do understand why it's there, if you understand why it was put in, somebody did the work to put it in there. If you understand the specifics of the situation, then we can talk about the value of taking it down or not. But if you don't understand it, you've lost all of the context. Taking that thing down runs a risk that was a load-bearing fence. Now the road is going to collapse. Or that fence kept away some animal that was kind of dumb and just needed to stay away from the fence. Or, hey, there's something right underneath there that we wanted to prevent somebody from driving over. So you have this notion that if your code base, if you feel like the code base is too complex and therefore I need to rewrite it, that is a guarantee you don't need to rewrite it. You should not be rewriting it. Don't rewrite it until you actually fully understand what that code base is doing, how the thing works. because if you fail to understand what that code base is now, you are going to make many of the mistakes that the last group of people who built the code did. And you're probably going to end up putting in the same hacks that the last group did. And what you just have is, well, we spent a whole bunch of developer hours putting in this new system that basically the same, usually is better in some ways, but is worse in other ways. Usually a lot worse in some ways. So Cold Fusion, owned by Adobe, had a 2021 release. It's still in use. Cold Fusion developers, good job. Keep it alive. Solomon says JSON as a thing we're all going to switch to versus XML. Yeah, the idea of JSON as this is human readable. No, it's not. Which is why since then there's been YAML. YAML is human readable. No, it's not. None of these are really human readable. They're all more or less machine readable, not so much human readable. YAML is better than JSON, which is better than XML, but still, if your point of it is use this thing because it's human readable, nah, hard pass. Your data interchange measure, that system is probably not going to be human readable. So at the same time, I also don't want to make it sound like never upgrade any systems, never switch to anything new, that there is zero value in anything new. There is value. And that's where, there is a notion of technological decay, that things degrade over time. And if you have a system which does have this notion of decay, then yeah, upgrade. So for example, hardware. We have this concept of technological decay of hardware because you have patches that get put in. Remember when Spectrum Meltdown happened and Intel and AMD quickly put out a whole bunch of different firmware patches? Well, the net result of that was Intel CPUs got a fair amount slower as a result. All of our hardware just got slower because they needed to mitigate against this security flaw. And that happened for both Intel and AMD, even though AMD laughed at the time. They're like, oh, we're not susceptible to it. And then found out that, yeah, they were. I like AMD, but that was a little bit of showboating that got them. So you have that, but you also have, well, for this security patch, these software patches for this new functionality and operating systems, for all of the new functionality that comes in platforms and frameworks in other software that's installed. Well, this hardware is less capable of managing it. And also you have a drop dead date on hardware. Those drives will fail. They may fail 10 years after the mean time to failure, but they'll fail eventually. Those servers will eventually go bad. And depending on if you can repair the equipment, maybe you can keep it going. But at some point, there is a need to replace. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, the replacements aren't necessarily better. There's going full old man yells at cloud. There's a YouTube stream that I like that talked about the why toasters today are so much worse than toasters of the 30s. Because a toaster in the 30s, you could put in a piece of toast and it would just come out and it would be nice. It would be toasted. It wouldn't be, half burnt on one side and still not toasted on the other side. It would just work. And other equipment, microwaves, other dishwashers, many other things have gotten worse over the decades. Part of that is the choices people make. Dishwashers are much less, time efficient than they were 30 years ago. I remember growing up as a kid, you pop the dishes in the dishwasher, within 2 hours, they're done. Now you can put them in and
what you meant by toasters in the 30s, Kevin, or what you guys had here, but the toaster I grew up with was my mother would throw bread on a hot pan and turned it both ways so that it cooked.
Your mom was a toaster?
That was the toaster I grew up with, and that worked
Yeah.
extremely well.
Yeah, sure. No, there were older toasters, pre-electric toasters, where it was, or pre-electronic. It was still electric. You plugged it into a socket, and basically they would use a certain wire that, as it got hot, the tensile strength changed, and that's how your toast would pop up at a certain temperature. They didn't have temperature sensors in different parts of the toaster. Now, newer toasters do have those sensors, but the problem is that sensor is usually either right next to the heating element, so it pops up too soon, or it's on the opposite side of the heating element and it pops up too late. So by introducing this newer technology, you actually make the toaster worse as a result. And so that model from the 50s or the 40s is better at making toast than the model today.
Makes total sense.
Yeah, dishwashers 30 years ago, better at washing dishes than dishwashers today. The downside to it is dishwashers 30 years ago were loud, much louder, and used a lot more water. So basically the general trade-off, used more energy. The general trade-off was, now you have the dishwasher that runs for 8 hours, but it's also something that you could have a conversation in the same room while the dishwasher's going. So we see these moves where there are concepts that you do see trade-offs. You do see things that just because it's new doesn't necessarily mean it's better. It's an understanding of what are the trade-offs and is it worth making this move. If I could find a 1940s toaster that was still in good working condition, I probably would use it. Because I can't find one of those, I use the one I have. And it's important to keep that in mind, that it's not just novelty. Novelty is not itself an asset. Novelty is an indicator that it may be time to look, it may be time to compare, but just because this is the newest data platform technology doesn't mean it's better. Usually it means it's worse. Fewer safety features is also a trade-off. Absolutely. Yeah, those cars from the 1950s. You know what? You could run one of those 1950s Fords or Chevrolets into a wall, and that's okay. Those were heavy steel. They'd barely get dented. Your driver would be dead, but you just clean that thing out and sell it, and the next driver has a nice car. Modern cars are designed, to preserve the driver as opposed to preserving the car. So that is a trade-off. But then that's why cars crumple. And last thing I want to hit on this topic, since we are at the top of the hour, is the concept that we have with new technologies. Part of the reason why so many people, so many companies really push this notion of new equals good is they are trying to cross the chasm. So the classic business book, Crossing the Chasm, is about how do I get from the front leading edge of the 1-2% of early adopters into the next set of barely early adopters, and then cross that chasm into the vast majority of your customer base. And there's got to be a compelling reason for a lot of these mid and late comers to jump on. Well, the marketing people are trying to create that compelling reason by saying, oh, jump onto this because this is way better than what you have today. And that's getting back to Andy's point. That's kind of the thing that we want to understand and be aware of, that as a new technology comes out, as people start pushing the latest JavaScript platform of the week or the latest technological fad, we want to do that reasonable assessment, understand the benefits, understand the costs, do that analysis with the perspective of our organizations, our circumstances, and it could be that fad is, in fact, a really good thing to jump on. It could be that, hey, Ruby on Rails is exactly the right answer for this shop, for this company in these circumstances. And it could be that company's still using it a decade later, and it's working fantastic for them. And if so, great. But it doesn't mean here's the new technology, you got to change. We got to rewrite all of our stuff using this. Because generally that's a sucker's bet. Any piling on either of you want to do?
No, Kevin, I'm thinking longingly of dinner. Sorry.
Well, on that note, let's let Mala go. Tracy's already dropped out, so let's call it an evening. Thank you, everybody. Remember, tomorrow Priscilla Camp is going to talk about AI in Power BI. So stay tuned for that. We're gonna let Tracy back in so that we can all say goodbye. Maybe. So stay tuned for that. Come on by tomorrow, 6 p.m. Eastern time. But until we see you again, everyone, take care.